Let us all stand. We remember that we are always in God's loving presence. We pray in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Loving Father, we come before you in humble thanks for the chance to assemble here in this seminar on hope, hoping to gain a better knowledge of this priceless virtue that emerges from confidence in your love and promises. We know that in a world filled with obstacles, uncertainties, and hardships, hope is a lifeline that lifts our spirits and leads us to a brighter future. Lord, help us to feel your presence and guidance as we embark on this path of learning, thought, and prayer. Fill our hearts with hope so that we can be lights of your love and certainty in a world in great need of it. We pray for anyone who is afflicted by despair, doubt, or dread. May we use the insights gained from this session as healing and transformational tools in their life. Give us the wisdom to communicate the message of hope with compassion and empathy, knowing that your hope has the power to mend broken hearts and inspire weary souls. May your Holy Spirit be our constant guide as we listen to our speaker, engage in discussion, and dive into the wisdom of our faith. Help us to perceive signs of optimism in the world around us, such as acts of generosity, natural beauty, and the love we share. We entrust this seminar to you and beg for your blessing on everyone who are here. May the seeds of hope planted here bear fruit in our lives and in the lives of everyone we come into contact with. We offer this prayer with hope in our hearts, believing in your unchanging love and promise of a better tomorrow. We pray in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
So to formally open our ceremony, may we call on Professor Jonathan Chua, Dean of the School of Humanities, for his opening remark.
Good afternoon, everybody. Dr. Sunny Mendoza, Chair of the Theology Department, Professor Stephen Van Arp, co-founder of the KU-Leuven Ateneo Center for Catholic Theology and Social Justice, our speaker, Mary Doak, okay, faculty, students, and guests, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Ateneo de Manila and to the official launch of the KU-Leuven Center, Ateneo Center for Catholic Theology and Social Justice. This center was actually established just before the onset of the pandemic, and it stalled because of that. So I'm glad that after 3 or 4 years, it's finally proceeding with its program, including this afternoon's lecture by Professor Mary Doak. In hindsight, there is, I guess, something providential about the delay or the timing, because a center like this is certainly in keeping with what Father Arupe thought and declared, was the mission of a Jesuit educational institution, and that is the formation of men and women for others, hombres para los demás. We are commemorating the 50th anniversary of that directive, and what better way to do so than with the launch of a Center for Catholic Theology and Social Justice. So I must thank, I think, Wilson Espiritu, Dr. Mendoza, of course, and Stefan, who were instrumental in the establishment of the center. I think in increasingly divided world, it's very important to have some base or some center within which one can reflect on and assert a Catholic perspective. So, good afternoon to all of you again. I hope you learn from the lecture this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chua, for your opening remarks. To discuss a little bit about the center and to explain a bit more on what we're doing here, may we now call on Professor Ruben Mendoza, Chair of the Department of Theology, to present the center.
Magandang hapon sa lahat. Good afternoon to all of you. I'll say something a bit about our center, which we are launching this afternoon. Leading academic institutions in the Philippines, like our university, play a critical role in shaping the future of Filipino nation. Given their academic expertise, universities fulfill their critical role in nation building through instruction, research, and social action. Over the past decades, the Ateneo de Manila has established its reputation in the country in the area of instruction, particularly in the field of humanities. It has also been significantly engaged in various programs for social action. And at the moment, the university is in the process of strengthening its research capacity. It is thus a great opportunity to recover and promote the legacy of theology in this area as an essential aspect of the Ateneo education and as part of the institution's participation in nation building. So in close collaboration with the Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium, the Department of Theology of Ateneo de Manila will starting a center for the study of Catholic theology and social justice. Our center is dedicated to provide contributions that critically examine sociopolitical, economic, and ecological concerns in critical dialogue with the rich tradition of Catholic theology and the varied ways that tradition has been integrated with and interrogated by Filipino social, cultural, and indigenous traditions. Upholding the Ignatian core values of finding God in all things, commitment to faith and justice, and the formation of men and women for others, the center will conduct research intended for better theological discernment of contemporary local and global issues in order to promote a Catholic theological perspective and responses that serve the common good and signifies the proleptic presence of God's kingdom in the here and now. Specifically, the center will organize lectures such as this one, seminars which we had this morning, symposia and conferences, and even artistic or performative artworks, and publish research works and relevant materials that theologically tackle issues pertinent to social justice. So it is with pride that we launch this center today and launch it with the lecture of our esteemed guest, Dr. Mary Doak.
Thank you, Professor Mendoza. So to introduce our speaker for today, may we now call on Dr. Wilson Espiritu.
Dr. Jonathan Chua, the Dean of the School of Humanities. Founding directors of the Center, Professor Ruben Mendoza and Professor Stefan Van Erp. Our international guests, esteemed scholars and faculty members, students, guests, it is with great enthusiasm that I stand before you to introduce our guest speaker for the inauguration of the KU-Leuven Ateneo Center for Catholic Theology and Social Justice. On this momentous occasion, we are graced with the presence of an esteemed professor of theology, Professor Mary Doak. Professor Doak holds a PhD from the University of Chicago. From 2007 onwards, she has dedicated herself to the noble task of teaching at the University of San Diego, encouraging students to delve into the complexities of theology and society. Besides teaching, Professor Doak has served in distinguished leadership roles, including her tenure as president of the College Theology Society from 2019 to 2021, and as president of the American Theological Society Midwest from 2007 to 2008. Currently, she is a trustee of the Parliament of the World's Religions, further solidifying her impact on a global scale. Professor Doak's two recent publications, A Prophetic Public Church, Witness to Hope Amid the Global Crises of the 21st Century, and Divine Harmony, Seeking Community in a Broken World, showcase her commitment to addressing contemporary challenges through the lens of theology. Her extensive body of work, spanning books and articles on public theology, ecclesiology, and eschatology, reflects a dedication to understanding the intricate intersections of faith and the pressing issues of our time. It is thus fitting to have her deliver the first public lecture of our center. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to a scholar whose wisdom transcends the boundaries of academia and resonates deeply with the mission of this center. Professor Mary Doak, we are honored to have you with us today.
Good afternoon. I am deeply, deeply grateful to all of you who have so graciously welcomed me to your wonderful country and have so generously hosted me here. I am honored and delighted to have been invited to celebrate with you the opening of the Center for Catholic Theology and Social Justice. This collaboration between the Ateneo de Manila and the Catholic University of Leuven promises to do much good and bring much hope to our suffering world. In fact, the topic of my talk this afternoon was inspired by the too rare feeling of hope I experienced when I heard of this new center. It's a great pleasure to gather with you to celebrate the gift this center promises to be to the church and to the world. I'd also like to mention that as a North American, I'm well aware that I'm going to speak out of a social location and out of particular experiences that are already overrepresented in theology. As I speak of what Pope Francis has called the humble virtue of hope, I'd like to offer my remarks as a humble contribution to an ongoing dialogue that I hope will move to the center perspectives from the global south and especially from the Philippines, from which the world and the church have so much to learn. I myself have learned a great deal already from people here, from Dr. Raymond Aguas. I've learned about Gustavo Gutierrez in ways that I think about every time I teach that topic. From Dr. Wilson Espiritu, I have learned to challenge myself and my approach because his is the best method for public theology I have yet heard. And from the faculty members I met this morning from the theology department here at the Ateneo, I learned more than I can say about project of theology in the 21st century. So I would like to offer my very US-centered reflections tonight, which will include bringing into the conversation some marginalized American figures. I hope to continue learning from this dialogue with you all this afternoon and into the future. Pope Francis has called hope the most humble of the theological virtues. He suggests that hope is humble because he thinks it's less obvious in our lives than are the other two theological virtues, faith and love. At least in Pope Francis's pastoral experience, people usually know if they lack faith or struggle to love others, but when he asked them if they had hope, they weren't sure if they did or not. Perhaps hope is more conspicuous in its absence. We recognize when we're overwhelmed with despair, but may be unaware of being sustained by hope. The Pope, I think, wants to draw our attention to the fact that, like so much that is humble and overlooked in this world, hope quietly does the essential work of sustaining us amid the struggles of this life. But it's not only our individual or personal lives that depend on hope. Also said, attributed to Pliny the Elder, but that's not been confirmed, said that hope is the pillar that holds up the world. If that's the case, and I think it might be, then the virtue of hope is vital to our common lives, to our societies and institutions, as well as to our personal flourishing. Alas, our world today is filled with great suffering, as has been more or less the rule throughout human history. Wars, diseases, grinding poverty, injustice, cruelty, violence continue to plague humanity. Without hope, people cannot persist amid this enormity of suffering. There are, of course, countless courageous people who face unbearable circumstances with great hope. Yet, many others in even less painful circumstances lack hope and are overcome by despair. In the United States, and I suspect it's not only in the United States, we're experiencing an epidemic of what are called deaths of despair. People are dying at high rates from suicide and from the drug and alcohol addictions that are forms of slow suicide. Especially heartbreaking when the young, who should be so filled with hope, see their future is so bleak they believe their lives are not worth living. The perennial problem of finding meaning in a world of suffering is, I think, compounded by globalization, which confronts us with crises that are unprecedented in the scale of destruction and suffering they are currently inflicting and the greater suffering they may yet unleash. There is, of course, nothing new about poverty, about migration, or even about environmental degradation. The three global crises I draw attention to here. But we have never before had to deal with a global capitalist economy that's uniting more than 8 billion people while leaving nearly half the world's population struggling to meet their basic needs. Among the massive numbers of migrants in the world today, more than 100 million of our brothers and sisters are forcibly displaced due to violence, and that number doesn't even include migrations caused by poverty, famine, or natural disasters. Anthropogenic climate change is increasing the severity of hurricanes, fires, heat waves, and floods, and generally undermining the conditions of life on this planet. And of course, the global economy, as currently structured, increases climate change, and both climate change and the economy contribute to the pressures on people to migrate. I see these three crises as interrelated. The good news is that we know how to significantly mitigate, if not completely solve, these problems. The bad news is that we lack the collective will to do so yet. Our political paralysis in the face of these global challenges is, I think, both a symptom and a cause of lack of hope in humanity's future. Perhaps ironically, the middle of the 20th century saw an explosion of philosophical and theological discussions of hope. Ernst Bloch's The Principle of Hope called for a future-oriented philosophy focused primarily not on what is, but rather on the possibilities that might yet come to be in our ever-changing reality. Jürgen Moltmann provided a theological version of this shift in his groundbreaking Theology of Hope, written, he said, to give expression to the hope he found in God when, as a prisoner of war, he had to face the horrors of what Germany had done, especially to the Jewish people during the Second World War. Not long after Moltmann's Theology of Hope, Gustavo Gutierrez's Theology of Liberation and James Cone's Black Theology of Liberation reminded us that Christians' hope in God is a hope for the full liberation of the oppressed in as well as beyond history. And at about that same time, Johann Baptist Metz argued for a practical fundamental theology in which Christian faith would be defended not through theoretical arguments, but rather through an active hope, a praxis grounded in confidence in God's promises to the victims of history. With all of this relatively recent attention to hope, we might wonder why so many today are bereft of hope. Some feel this lack personally as they despair over their own lives. Others may have a confidence in the worthwhileness of their own lives, but have little hope for our global future. Even within the church, I often find more fear than hope for the church's future. The first letter of Peter instructs Christians to always be prepared to offer an explanation to anyone who asks for the hope that is in you. Today, we might wonder how often Christians demonstrate sufficient hope that they might be called to account for it. Perhaps we might think it's hard to sustain hope today because of the magnitude and the complexity of the crises we face. But difficult situations are not contrary to hope. In fact, they are the occasion for hope, as Thomas Aquinas argued. We do not generally invoke hope for what is readily achievable, goals that we can easily attain, graduating from college, a call for an appropriate plan and effort, but not the virtue of hope. Hope is properly directed to what is difficult, though not impossible to achieve. Surely then it is not the complexity, not the difficulty of our problems that's undermining hope for so many today. There are no doubt a variety of factors contributing to this loss of hope, and I have no intention of trying to offer an adequate assessment. However, I do think my time today, I'd like to take a closer look at the Christian tradition's thought on hope, because I believe it provides significant insights into what may be undermining hope in our times and what may be causing so much despair. Drawing on Aristotle's work on the virtues, St. Thomas Aquinas contends that one properly hopes for something that is difficult, arduous to achieve. And so when we hope for that difficult goal, we also hope in another or others who might assist us in attaining what we cannot easily accomplish on our own. Indeed, Aquinas said, we hope chiefly in our friends. And thus, he argued, hope is perfected in charity. This means, I argue, that we must hope in others, but we also must hope with others and for others. Besides trusting in others to help us, we must share a common hope with them and for them, as well as for ourselves, so that together we might realize the desired goal that is beyond our individual abilities to achieve. Okay, so that you know the general plan of where I'm going with this and can take heart when you begin to sense the end approaching, I'll tell you, I have three main topics I've just begun the first one, hope with, in, and for others. After that, I want to second to discuss some of the barriers to hoping with, in, and for others. And then finally, I'll discuss the centrality and importance of hope in God. I want to suggest here that some of the lack of hope today is due to the deterioration of community bonds and mutual trust. On the global level, the self-interestedness evident in international relations undermines hope that our countries might work together to achieve those goals we cannot achieve alone. Moreover, in those countries, especially my own, where we don't have an adequate safety net and community bonds and family life have deteriorated, the message that each person is on his or her own comes through loud and clear. This culture of individualism, so common in the global north, has made the very idea of hope with, in, and for others virtually incomprehensible to my students, even at the Catholic University of San Diego, where I teach. They're good kids. As far as I can tell, they seem to lead fairly healthy social lives. They love their families and friends, but their default understanding of themselves is as what we'd call atomized individuals. This is so deeply ingrained in them that they struggle to understand anything like a common hope, a hope to be shared and achieved together. Instead, they inevitably, and despite my best efforts, interpret Catholic social teaching about the common good as referring to some collection of personal goods and desires that they all happen to have, something like a least common denominator approach. They can't grasp that there might be a good we all participate in that is itself something shared in common. As you can imagine, the idea that no one is saved alone, as Pope Benedict sought to remind us, is an idea that's foreign to them. If they're religious at all, salvation for them is a me and Jesus thing. Caring for others is either a lifestyle choice or an arbitrary test they have to pass to be accepted by Jesus. Could it be that many people lack hope today because they understand themselves to be fundamentally on their own, unable to imagine hoping with, in, and for others? In his celebrated encyclical Laudato Si', Pope Francis provides a deeper diagnosis of this breakdown of community, as he warns that solidarity and mutual concern are being replaced by the technocratic paradigm dominating so much of public life. He clarifies he's not at all against technology in itself. He's deeply disturbed by the growing global tendency to evaluate everything in terms of its use value. This is especially the case insofar as the economy has become an idol, the ultimate good to which everything else in society is subordinated. Any and all technological advances are welcomed as a source of profit. Potential market value is often the sole public standard of something's worth. The natural world is then viewed simply as an economic resource, to the point that plants, animals, the earth itself, and even humans are valued according to what they can contribute to the economy. Francis further warns that everything then is also disposable, including people. Those who cannot contribute to the economy, who have nothing to sell and little or no money with which to buy, are worthless, according to this technocratic paradigm. Such people, the poor, the elderly, the sick, disabled, increasingly have no place in society and are forced to subsist on the margins and in the shadows. Pope Francis has correctly pointed out that the global crises of our time cannot be solved unless and until we reject the dominance of this technocratic paradigm. To ensure a more just distribution of economic goods and opportunities, to welcome migrants, to protect the environment, these all require a recognition of the intrinsic value and the interconnectedness of creation. We cannot build a more just economy if we are focused on maximizing short-term profits. We will not welcome migrants and other refugees if we're dominated by an instrumental logic, since these are often disposable people with little market value. And if they do have market value, then to welcome them is to risk one's own displacement in the fierce competition to survive in this economy. Most certainly, we cannot mitigate the climate crisis unless we stop viewing nature as nothing more than raw material to be used and used up in the relentless drive to produce more and more marketable things. Perhaps then, it is no wonder so many are hopeless. This technocratic paradigm is powerful and pervasive. Its insidious reduction of everything to market or use value undermines the sense of interconnection we need to hope with, in, and for each other. And yet, there is hope. Time and again throughout history, people have rejected culturally dominant paradigms that were contrary to the justice and love in which humans thrive. Among the great witnesses whose rejection of the status quo gave hope to others, I would like to lift up the example of Harriet Tubman, whose story is well known in my country, but still I think bears retelling. In my opinion, she is quite likely the most amazing American who ever lived. She's an excellent model of rejecting a dehumanizing paradigm in favor of a life of hope with, in, and for others. Harriet Tubman was born a slave in the United States in Maryland in 1822. She was clearly, as a slave, among those seen by the dominant society of her day as disposable, of only use value. In fact, at one point, she was so sick and worn out by the work of slavery that they tried to sell her and nobody would even buy her for a few pennies, which showed how little value she had in the world. But she refused to accept that value of herself as someone of use value alone. And she escaped from slavery, risking the horrific torture that was meted out to slaves who were caught running away. But, this is where her story gets especially interesting, as she reported later, having gained the desperately sought for freedom, she was not happy being free alone, without her community of family and friends. So she returned to Maryland several times, risking her own freedom to guide others to freedom. Apparently, she never lost a single person in these escapades. All who trusted her, all who dared to hope for freedom with her, made it safely out of slavery. She wasn't even deterred by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which meant that they weren't even safe in the northern states. They could now be hunted, captured, and sent back to slavery from any state in the Union. Escaped slaves were only free then in Canada. So she extended the journey, taking escaped slaves all the way through the northern United States and across the border into Canada. The journey was much longer and more difficult. She traveled at night and mostly in the cold winter months when nights were longer so they could cover more ground. To me, not surprising then that Frederick Douglass, another escaped slave and a leading abolitionist at the time, said that Harriet Tubman was the bravest person he ever met. She so valued the bonds of community that what we might call being a person for others continued her entire life. Knowing that these refugees from slavery lacked resources with which to start their new lives, she grew food and collected donations to provide assistance, even while in dire poverty herself. After the Civil War ended and all slaves in the United States were officially freed, she fought a decades-long battle for the pension she was owed as a nurse, cook, and extremely adept spy for the Union Army. More interesting stories about her there, but I'll have to skip those for now. With the money she was finally able to gather, she started a home to provide shelter for elderly former slaves who could no longer work for a living. She ended up dying, risking a great deal. She died at the age of 91 among the community she had served. She lived her life with and for others, especially for those others that her society considered disposable people, slaves who were legally no more than property to be used by and for the benefit of others. She rejected that dominant paradigm, refusing to consider herself or other enslaved people as anything other than human beings with great intrinsic value. She knew, as Pope Francis continually insists, that we are so thoroughly interconnected that we can only achieve our deepest hopes together because we only truly flourish together. This hope within and for others, I would argue, is essential to any hope worthy of a human being. This new Center for the Study of Catholic Theology and Social Justice here at the Ateneo is another source of hope within and for others, which, as I mentioned earlier, is why the news of the opening of this center inspired my topic for tonight. When people come together to address and overcome society's injustices, we have reason to hope for a better, more just, and more humane future. Moreover, working with others for a more just world is a public commitment to our common good in rejection of the individualistic and technocratic paradigms that pit us against each other. This center is especially a gift of hope because it is rooted here at the Ateneo in the Philippines. For too long, we who live in the global north have assumed that justice can be defined and the world's injustices set right by people from the global north alone. We haven't done so well with that approach, have we? If we're going to create a more just and humane future, we need all of our views and voices, but we especially need the perspectives, experiences, and wisdom of those whose insights have too often been marginalized. This center is a great gift, particularly because it brings people together to understand the causes of injustice and to explore possible solutions from the perspectives and experiences of the people here in the Philippines. And yet, I believe there are more significant obstacles to achieving that state of shared hope within and for others than my above discussion has thus far suggested. In a world of systemic injustice and oppression, mutual trust is eroded to an extent, I believe, that simply recognizing the errors of individualism, the distortions of the technocratic paradigm, will not overcome. As the 20th century American theologian Howard Thurman has shown, pervasive injustice significantly distorts our inner lives, impeding the solidarity integral to hoping within and for others. So for those of you who are paying attention, we're in the second part of the talk. Thurman was a profound and creative American theologian whose work had considerable impact among other African Americans, including the American civil rights leader, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Unfortunately, Thurman's work was, until recently, largely ignored by white theologians. Thurman was himself the grandchild of slaves. He was born and grew up in segregated Florida, where what we call the Jim Crow laws instituted an American form of racial apartheid, these laws were enforced most of his life. In his 1949 book, Jesus and the Disinherited, Thurman reminds his readers that Jesus and the majority of his followers were poor Jews who were among the deeply oppressed peoples under the Roman Empire. Jesus' preaching was not, then, primarily addressed to those of power and privilege in his day. Thurman contends that we miss a great deal of Jesus' message if we don't pay serious attention to what he had to say to his fellow peasants, those whom Thurman calls the disinherited, because they were denied their share of society's resources and protections. These are the people that Pope Francis would call the disposable ones. Drawing no doubt on insights from his own experience, Thurman noted that to be disinherited means that you live with the knowledge that your life does not matter to the larger community. The institutions of society that protect others are not extended to protect you from either the physical assaults, beatings, and even murder, as well as the frequent humiliation that the disinherited are subjected to. This was true for Jewish peasants under the rule of the Roman Empire, including Jesus and his followers. It's true for Black people in the United States, many others. It remains true for all the disposable, all the disinherited peoples on this earth. There are few things more devastating, Thurman observed, than to have it burned into you that you do not count and that no provisions are made for the literal protection of your person. This vulnerability makes the disinherited, Thurman argues, liable to fear, deception, and hatred, which Thurman describes as the three hounds of hell that threaten the inner lives of the oppressed. The first hound, fear, is a reasonable self-protective stance for those facing the nearly constant dangers of life without the basic protections of society. The second of these hounds of hell, deception, follows as a way to survive and maybe even to get ahead when one cannot do so through open and honest means. The oppressed learn to deceive their oppressors, to pretend to be and to do what the powerful want in order to mislead them and mitigate the oppression. The third hound of hell is hatred. A hatred that arises as one rejects this unfair treatment and the systematic denial of one's self-worth. However reasonable these reactions of fear, deception, and hatred are, Thurman argues, these temptations are the hounds of hell because of the extent of the damage they do, including to the oppressed or the disinherited themselves. Living in fear takes a terrible toll on one's physical health as well as one's mental well-being, which medical studies today confirm. Deception, regularly practiced, becomes a habit that causes one to lose the ability to recognize the truth. Tempted to make some comments about public figures who no longer are able to recognize the truth. They lie so much, but I'll let you come up with your own examples. And when you can't recognize the truth, you can't have honest relationships. Finally, Thurman argues, hatred is not easily contained. It becomes an all-consuming attitude, leaving no room for love of others. This is why, Thurman contends, Jesus taught his followers to fear not the one who can kill only the body, to be truthful, so their yeses mean yes, and to love all, including especially their enemies. Thurman's analysis reveals that in situations of oppression, the disinherited are under considerable pressure to adopt strategies that may help them survive, but will at the same time undermine their own integrity, as well as their ability to work with others to overcome their oppression. To the extent that the oppressed give in to the temptations of fear, deception, and hatred, they become isolated, cut off from each other, and incapable of the mutual trust essential to hoping within and for others. The hounds of hell, fear, deception, and hatred, leave no room for faith, hope, and love. As someone who comes from among the globally privileged, I cannot speak to how accurately Thurman describes the situation of the oppressed or the disinherited. However, Thurman's analysis is not limited to the temptations plaguing the oppressed. Thurman was a mystic who was deeply aware that everything is interconnected. He realized that relations of oppression distort the lives of all involved. Means that those who benefit from social oppression face their own temptations of fear, deception, and hatred. The powerful deeply fear the loss of privilege that protects them from the horrors being inflicted on the oppressed. They also, and perhaps even more deeply, fear the humiliation of losing their sense of their own self-righteousness if they're forced to face the injustice of the system they benefit from. In fact, I'm kind of inclined to think that for Thurman, the fear of what might happen physically is less important than the fear of humiliation, whether it's the humiliation of the disinherited as though they don't count, or the fear of humiliation of the privileged who might have to face their own complicity in injustice. Moving to the other hounds, though, we are also inclined to deception. Thurman argues that those in control of society are inclined to deceive themselves and others by with what he calls the biggest lie of all, the lie that society is fundamentally just and fair. Finally, then, these oppressors are actually tempted to hate the very people they oppress, precisely because they fear that they may lose their social privilege and their self-righteous belief that they deserve their position. I find ample evidence to support Thurman's diagnosis that the relatively privileged are subject to the temptations of fear, deception, and hatred. Those who benefit from injustice frequently fear losing their privilege, becoming oppressed themselves. I think this fear is evident when, as commonly happens, pleas for a more just and equitable society are understood as plans to reverse positions so that the currently privileged become oppressed. Been fairly common in my context for women's demands for equality to be rejected as plans to oppress men. And today in the United States, statistics indicate that many white people believe that racism is more commonly directed against white rather than black or other people of color. But perhaps even more obvious, I think, is the profound fear of humiliation, the humiliation of facing the injustice one has benefited from and participated in. My colleagues studying white supremacy have noted that white people are commonly so attached to understanding, to insisting that they are good people, that they frequently experience emotional distress, referred to as white fragility, when confronted with the reality of systemic racism. This fear of humiliation has led to considerable deception in the teaching of history in the United States, even to the extent that notorious laws have been passed in some states to ensure that students are never taught anything that would make them feel ashamed of the past behavior of white people. Deceptive. And if violent and gratuitous attacks are indication of hatred, then we must conclude that many in the United States are succumbing to the temptation to hate the disinherited, as Black people, gay and transgendered people, and even the homeless are among those subject to arbitrary violent assaults simply for being who they are. Thurman's analysis of these three powerful and distorting hounds of hell also helps to explain our difficulty in responding adequately to what I have argued are the great crises of our time: the urgent need to establish greater economic equality, to welcome migrants, and to reduce climate change. Fear is without doubt a dominant factor in our failure to deal better with these challenges. The economic policies of the wealthy countries and the powerful corporations are driven by a fear that they who are currently benefiting might lose their position of economic dominance, perhaps becoming impoverished or bankrupt themselves. Migrants are themselves greatly feared as disruptive forces who will take people's jobs and cause the host population to lose its sense of being at home. And certainly, people in the United States, like in other rich and powerful countries, greatly fear that any action they take to decrease the use of fossil fuels will put them at an economic disadvantage, while others profit by continuing to increase their carbon output. I have often sensed those with the most to lose have the most fear. To continue applying Thurman's analysis to our contemporary crises, there's clearly widespread deception about the global economy, about migration, and about climate change. Pope Francis, in particular, has challenged the deception of trickle-down economics, which justifies gross inequality on the grounds that all people will eventually benefit and the conditions of the poorest will improve. As Pope Francis rightly stated, the excluded are still waiting. Regarding migrants, there's considerable deception in the United States, and the public depiction of migrants as predominantly drug traffickers and criminals, rather than as desperate and vulnerable families with children. And of course, the deception of the industry committed to portraying climate change as a vast scientific hoax is well established. Do these crises also lead to hatred today? I don't know what else would inspire the largely arbitrary but often extremely violent assaults on poor and vulnerable people, on migrants, on Blacks and homeless, other than hatred directed against the disinherited. The rise in racist and anti-immigrant authoritarianism in the United States and in many other countries also bears mention here. Political parties comprised of people who cling to whatever privilege they possess are quite public in their expression of violent and hateful attitudes toward vulnerable others. This hatred is surely behind the ugly tone of some contemporary politics, with a polarization of political positions that goes far beyond reasonable disagreement, particularly in the United States and Europe. Many political scientists, as well as pundits and public intellectuals, have been trying to figure out why people who disagree politically are so polarized today that they treat each other as enemies to be destroyed rather than as fellow citizens to be disagreed with. I don't think, by the way, that treating one another as enemies to be destroyed is a good recipe for a lasting society. But I'll leave that aside for now. Well, I've read myself quite a few good and helpful analyses of contemporary political polarization. I think the insightful perspective Thurman provides is even more helpful and is unfortunately lacking from these conversations. Is it not possible, maybe even likely, that this polarization today is an expression of hatred rooted in fear, as those who cling to a tenuous privilege in a brutal economic system fear those whose politics threaten that privilege and its illusion of self-righteousness. Now, if you are still with me, you might be feeling a bit, well, hopeless at this point. After calling for a shared hope, a hope within and for others, I think we found with Thurman that systemic oppression seriously undermines our fragile ability to work together. Not only are we humans limited and fallible beings, we are also, as the Christian faith insists, seriously inclined to evil. By the way, I fully agree with G.K. Chesterton that the doctrine of original sin is the one Christian doctrine for which we have empirical evidence. We are inclined to sin. And if Thurman is right, the already difficult task of creating a hope in, with, and for others is further impeded when systemic oppression reinforces webs of fear, deception, and hatred, surely the antithesis of the mutual trust and solidarity that shared hope requires. The situation looks pretty grim. But rest assured, I do not intend to end my talk on hope this afternoon, leaving you with this despair. We turn to the last section, hope in God. Aquinas, who suggested that hope involves trust in others, further argued, of course, that ultimately the other in whom we trust is God. We certainly need God, theological perspective, to enable us to reach our final goal of the communion of all within the divine life. That's a goal quite beyond the capacity of humans. Moreover, due to our sinful curving inward on ourselves, God is also essential to overcome the distortions that impede our ability to achieve even our natural levels of healthy community bonds and mutual aid. Thurman also points to hope in God as the antidote to the three hounds of hell, so that we are again able to hope within and for others. Breaking the cycle of fear and distrust is not easy. Oppression, as Thurman contends, creates a vicious cycle that increases division and leads to further injustice, as all involved seek to secure themselves as best they can in a threatening world. But Jesus had an answer for those whom society endangered and humiliated, whom society held as without value. Jesus embodied the divine love that recognizes each and every person, no matter how insignificant in the world's eyes, as a beloved child of God with infinite dignity and an eternal destiny that no human being or human action can take away. Nothing, as St. Paul wrote, can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. To reinforce this point, Thurman tells about a time in his childhood when Halley's Comet was visible in the night sky. He said there was lots of excited talk among his schoolmates about whether this comet might hit the earth and destroy it. One clear night, his mother woke him up to come outside and see the comet. As they stood looking at the night sky, Thurman asked his mother what would happen to them if the comet collided with the earth. He said, with an expression of deep and prayerful peace on her face, his mother, who had so very much to fear in those days of brutal lynchings of Black Americans, responded, "Why, nothing, Howard. We will be in God's hands, as we always are." That, to Thurman, was the message that Jesus brought to the disinherited, to the disposable people of his day. God's bestowal of unending life and intrinsic value can free you from being controlled by your fears, especially your fears of those who assault your body and deny your worth. In liberating people from lives dominated by fear, hope in God empowers them to resist the fear-based deceit and hatred that destroy their capacity for honest, loving relationships. Fortunately for myself and perhaps others here, God offers liberation also to the privileged or inherited classes, freeing us from our fear of losing our social privilege and power. We too can hope in the eternal life that far surpasses the fragile security we might attain through maintaining unjust systems. Perhaps more importantly, hope in a forgiving and merciful God who sees the truth about us and loves us anyway is a soothing balm for the humiliation that we in the privileged classes dread, the humiliation of admitting our participation in oppression and injustice. In God's eyes, we have dignity and value, even though we are not the righteous pillars of a just society that we so desperately want to believe we are. Thus, the privileged can also be liberated from the webs of fear, deceit, and hatred that divide us against each other. As Thurman's analysis suggests, hoping in a God whose love is an unearned gift counteracts the dominant paradigms of technocracy and individualism that Pope Francis has been so critical of. Knowing that one has intrinsic worth in God's eyes leads to the recognition that all of creation, all that God wills into being, has intrinsic value to God and is destined for communion in the divine life. A hope in God for anyone must then become a hope in God for everyone, for all that God hopes for the poor as well as the rich, for our enemies as well as our friends, for the global South as well as the global North, and as Johann Baptist Metz reminds us, for the dead as well as the living. Anything less than a universal hope is inadequate to the hope of Jesus of Nazareth, who pointed out to his followers that God makes the rain to fall on the unjust as well as the just. Jesus, who gave his life for the salvation of the world. The hope in God for all, including the dead as well as the living, is, of course, to anchor our hopes in a God beyond history. But that is the basis on which we hope also for history. Faith in the God of Jesus Christ and of the Hebrew Bible does not support the despair that turns away from the evils of history and the suffering in this world to focus solely on a better life elsewhere in the world to come. That would be a heartless and hopeless response to this world's pain. But if faith in God keeps us from despairing for human history, this faith also refuses the optimism that believes we can achieve perfection here. Such optimism also results in a heartless disregard for all of the dead and for all whose lives might be sacrificed to achieve a liberation that can never be permanent or perfect in history. Rather, as Pope Benedict XVI astutely maintained, it is only if we have a hope beyond history that we are able truly to hope for history. Hoping in God's future beyond this world reassures us that history matters and that this world can become more just because its injustices are contrary to the ultimate nature of the universe. Thus, we are promised, as stated in Gaudium et Spes, we will find there again, in God's future beyond history, all that we have achieved here in history, perfect. So, of course, a hope in God is also not a passive hope. Freed from the incapacitating power of fear, the oppressed can dare to resist their oppression and refuse to accept their devalued status. They can, as James Cone says, step into God's promised future now, at least in part. Similarly, the oppressors are freed from their own considerable fears to join in dismantling the structures of injustice that inflict so much suffering now, even if we have to acknowledge the possibility of new structures of injustice developing again in the future. recognizing that what truly matters and what really persists is communion in God. All who place their hope in God are freed to love, to do what they can to honor God's creation, to bet their lives, as my colleague Orlando Espin has so beautifully put it, to bet their lives on the belief that God is compassionate, especially to the poor. I described Harriet Tubman's life as above as an example of the power of hope in, with, and for others. We should note that for Tubman, too, her remarkably active hope was rooted in her faith in God. She believed that she was empowered by a God who intended for all people to be free and who promised, as she said, that they would be free in death, if not in life. As she later explained, she understood that God's time is always near. He set the North Star in the heavens. He gave me the strength in my limbs. He meant I should be free. As Tubman's life shows, faith in the God who gives an everlasting meaning to our lives is not contrary to work for a better world here. In fact, it is the source of the liberating hope that frees us to live with and for others in courageous love. As Christians, us who are Christians here, we've been called to live and to share this active hope, especially as ecclesia, as church. It is our mission, enlivened by the Spirit, to witness to and work for the universal communion that is already breaking into history, even if we only achieve it completely beyond history. In the face of the unprecedented scale of major crises causing so much suffering today, we are called as members of the church to witness to a trust in God that empowers us in hope, to risk the vulnerability of sharing economic resources, of welcoming migrants, and of protecting the natural world. At the same time, as Catholic social teaching has clarified, we have a responsibility to work for national and international policies that are no longer based on the zero-sum logic in which we pursue our own security at the expense of others. Instead, we should seek a more just and peaceful world for all, a world where all have the means of a dignified life, a world where fewer become refugees, but all who are uprooted have safe homes, a world where the transition to sustainable energy ends the release of greenhouse gases into the environment. This is important work, but as sinners called to be in the company of Jesus, we know that we can do this work only insofar as our trust is ultimately in God and not in ourselves or even in the church. And thus we see again and more deeply the hope that this new Center for Catholic Faith and Social Justice brings. The Center's commitment to work for social justice, to study humanity's problems and its resources, is not designed to depend on humans alone, but to engage the Catholic and Trinitarian faith in a God beyond history, who nevertheless suffers with us in history and remains within the world as the nurturing, healing, and life-giving spirit of compassionate love. Grounded in the sustaining hope of God's liberating future beyond history, the work of this center promises to be a great source of hope with, in, and for a suffering world that desperately needs the hope for this world that comes from a greater hope beyond this world. In conclusion, feel free to heave a sigh of relief. In conclusion, I would like to recall that modern theology sought to respond to the problems of the non-believer. Liberation theology began to respond to the challenges of the non-person. Perhaps there's another concern that theology must address in our time: the despair of the non-hopeful. As Christians, we've been given a great gift of hope from God, passed down through the centuries by a cloud of witnesses, including Harriet Tubman and Howard Thurman, people who lived this hope despite the horrors of their times. As Thurman has shown, faith in God, who calls us to an unending communion in the divine life, is the ultimate source of our hope, a hope that frees us to live in love with and for all others in God's ultimately good creation. May God bless the work of this center so that it may be a gift of hope, anchored in faith and working in love for all of God's creation. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Hello? So thank you, Professor Doak, for that wonderful presentation. Very relevant and very timely for us to reflect on. We do have some time for a couple of questions for the open forum. So if anyone has any questions, you can approach the mic. So there's a mic over there. And then for those on this side, I can also hand over the mic.
Questions, comments, rebuttals, corrections?
So if while everyone's gathering their thoughts, so I'll start with my own question. So again, thank you, Professor Doak, for that presentation and for that input. I really resonated a lot with your points on the very atomized individual and this understanding that makes it more difficult to see a common good and to even see one's complicity because of that lack of connection. And I see that also with some of my students when I ask them to tell me the story of themselves that they tell themselves. And so I guess I'd like to maybe hear your thoughts also on that, like how might we cultivate that an alternative narrative maybe, like in relation to hope in God, in relation to that story of like, well, I'm just me. So yeah, I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Wow, that's great. I love the idea that you ask them to tell their story and see what comes up, because that reveals what we actually think when we're not thinking about what we think of ourselves. That's really challenging. I think that is the challenge of the church, as a community, to help us learn that new story. The point of liturgy is to practice together retelling the story of our communion. And that's why I think it's so important. And again, Benedict in his discussion of the Eucharist emphasized so much that it's not just you communing with Jesus, we're all communing together. We need to practice our faith liturgically in ways that reinforces that bigger story. But I do think also the other thing that comes to my mind is, the experience of needing people, being cared for by people, supporting each other is probably, in my experience, the other, besides kind of the church's attempt to enculturate us into the practice of another narrative, the experience in one's own life of needing and receiving the help from another can do so much to change that narrative at least in my life it has. And on the other hand, when we don't have that experience, when we are left alone, it's much harder to learn that truth that Pope Francis keeps emphasizing: everything is connected. So thank you. That's a great example of how to work with students. I thank you for that.
Thank you. But it's also not just me. I'm part of a cluster of teachers who asked that. So I
Great.
also don't want to make like it was my thing.
Sure.
Any other questions, comments that people might want to ask? Okay. Kindly just state your name and institution.
Good afternoon po. I'm Nathan from the Theology Department. Um, I have three questions, but let me state one. First and foremost, is it possible that the communitarian sense of hope begins with the philosophy of personalism? And secondly, is it possible in Thurman's thought that hatred be an antagonist of fear and oppression, then a factor that makes up the tripod of injustice?
Okay, the first one was the communitarian sense of hope grounded in the philosophy of personalism.
Personalism.
And the second, I couldn't quite hear. Can you hold that a
Is
little
it
up?
possible in Thurman's thought that hatred be an antagonist of fear and oppression, then a factor that makes up the tripod of injustice?
Oh, I think I see what you're saying.
And
Okay.
then thirdly, is it possible that hatred be divine and be led to a kind of altruistic love?
I'm going to answer, stay there. I want to hear more about that last one. Let me answer the first ones, because that last one I've got to hear more from. Okay, so yeah, I think if I'm understanding you correctly, I think what we were talking about just a minute ago is very much about needing to have a very different sense. That we've been taught that we are individuals and we need to understand a relational view of the person, which the more you're exposed to, it just is true, but it's not something we tend to notice because we're taught to see things otherwise. So yes, I think learning to understand ourselves in that kind of basic sense, which is not only Christian or even only religious, but we certainly have versions of it, is really important. That the individualist philosophy of the self is rather modern aberration that can be shown to be untrue if we think about it. So I like that. I think what you're saying is that the second question, hatred, fear, and deception are a tripod that form the basis of oppression. Well, at least they certainly reinforce it. Right? That when you get stuck in that, at least that's what I get from Thurman, and that's how I'm interpreting him, that when you get stuck in those reactions to oppression, you end up reinforcing it, whether from the side of the oppressed where you can't work with others to overcome it, or from the side of the oppressors, most certainly. So the last one, I want to hear more. Tell me that one again. That was a big question.
Is it possible that hatred be divine and be led to a kind of altruistic love? Say, for
Hatred-
example, hatred for injustice, hatred for inequality, something like that.
Okay. You can sit down. I think I got what you're saying. But you can stay there if you want to talk back. That's really interesting. In a way, Thurman starts with that idea when he says that hatred by the oppressed is all three of these work for a good reason. They help them rightfully reject their oppression to affirm that they are worth more than this. So certainly at that beginning point for him, he would agree with that, except that he said it has a tendency to take over, that it doesn't stay there. And that's why he thought Jesus had to teach us love for our enemies, that once you start hating, even if it's grounded in righteousness, he does not think it would be the grounds. But that's something worth exploring. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from audience?
Yes.
Just state your name and institution.
Good afternoon, Professor. My name is Wella. I'm from the Theology Department. So thank you very much for that very enriching talk. I think that virtue is something that we need right now, in today's world. Now, my question is, with regards to your third part of your talk, which is about hope in God, which is, of course, essential, as we look forward to that communion in the divine life eventually. But how do we bring this concept to people who do not believe? Like, for example, the agnostics, the atheists. Do we then limit hope in the self and with and in others? Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Thank
a
you.
really powerful comment that bears a lot more thought than I think I can give it right now. My first kind of thoughts about this as I wrote it was from a slightly different perspective. It's that so many of my students, so much of my country, so many of the youth, especially in the secular societies, just don't see the need for God, and yet they are living with a great deal of despair. So my thinking was, maybe we have something to help people, something to share that could help them. You're asking, I think, for me to take a different angle, which is very helpful. What do we have to bring to people who just don't have that hope in God? And there are people, because they're, as we know, there are ways in which we live things on many levels beyond what we consciously think. There are people grounded in a confidence in a greater hope than they can account for, that may not be comfortable with talk about God, but can feel that hope. I do think, I'm also thinking back to Johann Baptist Metz's argument that we defend our hope not predominantly in words, but in actions that affirm the lives of the victims and that give hope to the victims of history. So I think also there are ways in which we can, thank you for making me think of it this way, there are ways we can share hope. Maybe this gets back to our conversation about how we hope with, by giving hope to others, we can affirm a deeper hope defended in our practice rather than in our words. I hope that, thank you for challenging me to think about that in a broad perspective.
Any last questions or comments? Okay. Kindly just state your name.
Hello, I'm Ray Sanchez, also from the Theology Department. Thank you so much for your very hopeful message and input. I'm very lucky to be able to ask this question to someone from the US. So right now we are becoming more familiar with the woke culture among the youth, and it has been perceived in a mixed way. Some people appreciate it, some people don't. Some people see it as superficial. Some people see it as the youth just complaining. What is your take on it? And would you consider it as maybe is it a resource for hope, or is it something counterproductive and divisive?
I didn't complete. You said what we're talking about is the culture of what?
Woke.
Oh, woke. That's the word I missed. The culture of supposed wokeism. Yes, sorry. So, the idea, I'm sorry, I got a lot of things. When we talk about the culture of youth, and I read it all through the lens of my 26-year-old, who's very much spending her life on TikTok. But she's also, I can see some of the culture of wokeism. So the idea of being woke came from the people who were woke, had woken up to the injustices of society. That should be a good thing. They are freed from the deceptions that this society is ultimately fair and just, when it most obviously is not. On the other hand, so that's the hopeful part of it. And it also, it means that for a lot of the youth all over the world today, from what I can see in the media, there is a deep concern for creating a more just world. They are very, very upset and they stand very strongly against what they perceive as systemic injustice and racism. I have some concerns that we are not adequately teaching them to understand the complexities that all good and all bad don't easily line up on opposite sides. That once they recognize the distortions and injustices of one side or in somebody else, does not free the other sides and themselves from also having injustices and distortion. That further complexity we haven't seemed to have communicated well, and I'm a little concerned that there is, because then it ends up feeding into a binary of us versus them, which can become a new form of exclusion and oppression. So, in sum, overall, I think being awakened to the injustice is a great thing, but we need to help people learn to think more nuanced about the fact that there is none who is righteous, no, not one. We all have to be alert to potential injustice within ourselves, our side. Thank you very much, Rachel. Good question.
Okay,
Thank you.
Yeah, that's all the time we have for the open forum. So thank you so much again, Professor Doak, for that
Thank
talk.
Thank you all very much. You all are great.
So
Great privilege to be here.
So may we just ask Professor Mendoza and Dr. Espiritu to hand the certificate of appreciation and token to Professor Doak.
Let me read the certificate first. So the Department of Theology of the School of Humanities of the Ateneo de Manila University presents this certificate of appreciation to Professor Mary Doak for delivering a public lecture entitled The Gift of Hope, the Power of the Most Humble Virtue, given this 16th day of November 2023 here at Escaler Hall, Ateneo de Manila University.
Could we just get a photo in the middle, please? So to formally close our ceremony, may we ask Professor Van Erp to give our closing remarks.
Thank you very much. I was asked to say a few last words about the new center. And so what I would like to share with you are just a few thoughts about the inspiration and the motivation behind this new Center for Catholic Theology and Social Justice. And I would like to concentrate on the relationship between theology and social justice. What can we say as theologians about our political and social situation? And I'll start with, I'll keep it brief, so don't worry. So the weekend will start very soon. I will start with one of the parables in which Jesus tells the story of the hidden treasure in the field. It's in the Gospel of Matthew, and it says the following: "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up again, and then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that." End of quote. Now, this parable is, I think, telling us that God's reign can be discovered in the world, and that we should acknowledge and respect its hiddenness among us. Like the person in the parable, we are called to dedicate our lives to this place where God becomes present. Jesus' core message, that the time is fulfilled and that the kingdom of God is at hand, expresses something that is supposed to be already present in the secular, in the world that we live in. And it calls for an active and perhaps very surprising commitment and engagement with, I think, political consequences. The treasure that this person finds is buried again, and all possessions are sold, and the whole world becomes a field in which that treasure is hidden and where everything ultimately happens in order so that the scriptures might be fulfilled. Now, this image from the Gospel of Matthew of the hidden, found, and reburied treasure in a field is my guiding principle for working towards a theology of social justice in our present day context. A city like Manila, the cities that we live in, and the villages and the lands in between together form the global city with many dark and forgotten corners. And this global city could be discovered, I think, as the space where God becomes present. Theology, being part of the life of faith, is defined by a call to respond to the present situation, the time that we live in. And that response should be an expression of the desire to participate in the common good, the promised future that is hoped for in the present. So this resonates very well with what Mary Dokes has been telling us. A promised future, desiring the promised future that is hoped for in the present. Now, not by ignoring or by denying or by escaping the present situation, but by contributing to it through the embodiment of justice without any reserve. And this contribution is a response to what the theologians call ongoing incarnation, a word of faith which is shaped by following Christ, a practice of trust and risk. Responding to this ongoing incarnation is at the heart of what the Apostle Paul writes to the Colossians when he writes that he rejoices in, as he writes, in what I am suffering for you, and I fill up in my flesh what is still lacking in regard to Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, which is the church, in Colossians 1. By this, St. Paul does not mean that the prosecution and the imprisonment and the torture that Jesus Christ endured were a good thing. Like according to a very specific type of theology, Christ's suffering is to be understood as the satisfaction for human sin. His life of effort and suffering and pain, Christ's suffering, does, however, manifest the plausibility to have faith in the Christian message. That in the brokenness of people's lives and in the attempt to atone and heal them, to bring justice, God's glory, love becomes present. And it is worthwhile to engage with this hidden presence, even if this entails that pain and injustice will not go away. This is, according to St. Paul, the mystery that was revealed in the resurrection from the dead of the tortured Jesus, the radical injustice that calls for a response from people of faith. And in Colossians it says, the mystery that has been kept hidden for ages and generations, but is now disclosed to the Lord's people. To them, God has chosen to make known among the Gentiles the glorious riches of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. So according to St. Paul, people are each other's hope, each other's proclaimers of hope, each other's source and home in which God's work becomes manifest in the brokenness of our dependency. This comes close to your part two. We didn't negotiate this. The work of theologians, I think, feeds into this dependency, which is, I think, at the core of the Catholic view of the life of faith, and as such, also at the heart of Catholic social teaching. It is an anthropological, a universal view that seeks to include all people of goodwill who suffer and struggle, who fail and fall, who conquer and succeed when they strive for the common good. As members of a body, the community that is the church, they need each other. People are each other's hand and foot, eye and ear, heart and head, as it says in 1 Corinthians, so that God's glory will reveal itself in all the effort and suffering people experience on the way they walk together with each other's help and thanks to each other's engagement with one another, thus forming a community seeking justice. Now, the American Trappist monk Thomas Merton spoke about the Christian community as a body of broken bone. To him, this particular body is Christ's body, the body that resurrects in us, and as such, it is this presence of the resurrecting Christ that shapes Christian identity. And Thomas Merton describes this presence as follows. He writes in very strong language, Christ is torn apart, member after member. God in us is being murdered. But precisely there does God's solidarity with humanity become manifest. When Jesus, the icon of the invisible God, utters the words, "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" at the end of the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, it is a manifestation of ultimate despair and protest, but also of the ultimate witness that God can become present among the brokenness, and as such is the life source of faith that gives the power against cynicism and injustice, hope. So Christian life dwells in a body of broken bones that does not cease to resurrect against suffering and injustice. It seeks to heal, but not by being an identifiable unity over against others, an identity over against others, but instead by a call to respond by its awareness of mutual dependency, by its laments and its prayers, and by its acts of mercy. Instead of living with one particular identity between others, I think Christian believers live a life incomplete. But to have faith is not an identity, perhaps not to have an identity. A life incomplete, which they universally share with others. And as such, the Christian identity is governed by a lack, something we're missing, by that which it is not, rather than by a set of recognizable characteristics that you have to believe in. This lack, this standing with open hands, invokes our thirst, our hunger, invokes our works of mercy. In a video of the Jesuit Refugee Service, which is a worldwide organization that supports migrants and advocates their position, Pope Francis addresses the refugees and the rest of the world with the following statement. He said, although you are treated, talking to the migrants, although you are treated as a burden, a problem, and a cost deficit, you are truly a gift. You witness how a loving and merciful God has transformed the evil and injustice you have suffered into a blessing for all. End of quote. So Pope Francis voices here what Moses, who fled from Egypt, heard coming from a burning bush that does not get burned. When he carefully approaches it, Moses, God speaks to him from the thorn bush. And God says, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land. That's Exodus 3. So God's liberating force is like that burning bush, present amidst the brokenness of the lives of migrants, the poor, the people who are forced to be on the move. Among those, God is connected with the thorns, as it says, of their suffering and their struggles for life. The voice in the burning bush, speaking to Moses, manifests that seeking to understand the present situation and bring justice to it is a quality called for by God. Your third. And with a desire to matter for a future in which the world will fully come into its own, Christians believe that people, the poor and the marginalized especially, are the image of God. And as image of God, they show that our identity is not so much a complete whole that is violated by others, but that it is fundamentally lacking and broken. And that our sharing of that brokenness with those who need our love and care is nevertheless a very real attempt at the good life that human existence is aimed for, a place of justice and hope in which all will dwell. So, dear colleagues and students, the challenges for a theology of justice, which this new center will explore, are surrounding us in the present social situations of communities and people that depend on us, but much more important, that we depend on, because it is in them that the gospel speaks to us and does its ongoing work. Theologies of justice are therefore so much more than ethical and political responses to the present situation. They are reflections of the future to come, God's future for all. Now, I would like to thank Ateneo de Manila and my own institution, the Catholic University of Leuven, for making this important work possible. And I'm very much looking forward to collaborating with the people here at the Department of Theology, and I hope also with people from other departments, the Loyola School of Theology. The Center for Catholic Theology and Social Justice will hopefully find new ways to explore that burning heart that motivates Catholic institutions of learning and research, hidden treasure among us to which we are dedicating our work. So thank you all very much for being here with us. We're hoping for your input and your support. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Professor Van Erp, for your remarks. This is just the start for the center. We have more activities in the future, and we hope to see you all there. But in the meantime, we're ending and we're closing tonight's ceremony. Have a good rest of your weekend. Thank you.